Absolutely. All right, so let's jump into the first principle here.
Okay.
If the timeline is long, the design is wrong.
Right.
It's pretty direct.
Yeah, it is.
What's the core idea behind this one, and how does it play out in, the world of learning?
So I think the main idea is that when things take a long time to develop, by the time it's ready, it's no longer relevant.
Yeah.
So think about how fast the world is changing.
Oh my gosh.
Just the landscape technology evolves.
Right.
And what was super important at the beginning of a long project
Yeah.
could be completely outdated by the end.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And this really brings up how important it is to be agile in learning and development. So you've got things like agile learning design,
Yeah.
which is all about working in those short cycles,
Yeah.
building prototypes, getting feedback really fast, and iterating.
Yeah.
And one model for that is the SAM model, the successive approximation model,
Yeah.
which emphasizes that iterative approach.
Okay, so it sounds like the opposite of like that waterfall method, those long projects that
Get dragged out.
Yeah, yeah, and this connects with the idea of micro learning too, right? Those little, short focused bursts of learning.
Yeah.
Imagine you've got this 2-hour module, breaking that down into 5-minute lessons or something.
Exactly, yeah.
Allows people to grasp that information much faster, apply it and so on. So it's all about delivering what's needed when it's needed,
Yeah. Right.
Keep it lean, cut the fat speed, keeps projects on track, right?
Love it.
So what are like some immediate applications of this that our listener could think about,
Well, I think it raises the question, and as a learning creator, are you going for absolute perfection right from the start,
Mm-hmm.
which leads to those long timelines?
Yeah.
Or are you trying to get something valuable into the hands of learners quickly?
Yeah.
Because those shorter timelines, I think, force you to really focus on what you're trying to teach, the core objectives.
Right.
And it prevents what sometimes is called feature creep,
Oh, yeah.
where you just keep adding more and more,
Yeah, more and more.
which can dilute the whole thing.
And it can get overwhelming, and
Yeah.
it can make things, so complicated that people tune out, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So let's look at another principle.
Okay.
The best part is no part.
Okay.
This one might sound a little strange at first,
It does, yeah.
but what's the underlying message here?
I think it's about being ruthless, really getting rid of anything that is not absolutely essential for learning.
Right.
And an interesting connection here is to cognitive load.
Yeah.
Our brains can only process so much at once. Oh, yeah. So if you've got all this unnecessary stuff like redundant content graphics that are too complex and don't actually help people learn,
Right.
Cluttered interfaces,
Yeah.
that's all parts that can overload the learner, and they're not going to get it.
Yeah, they're going to check out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So applying minimalist UX principles,
Yeah. Yeah.
like reducing the navigation options, simplifying visuals,
Yeah.
that can be really helpful.
Well, I completely agree. So think about replacing big walls of text with clear, concise visuals
Exactly.
that just support what you're trying to teach.
Right.
Guide the learner to what actually matters. Simplicity wins. That's where to start.
I love that.
But this principle also prompts like a bigger question, right?
Yeah, it does.
Is training always the answer?
That's the question, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because if we think about it, the best part is no part. Encourages us to look at alternatives to the training we typically do. So, could you use a well-designed job, aid a quick reference guide?
Right.
Could you improve the process?
Yeah.
Or provide better on-the-job coaching?
Right.
Is that maybe better than a whole course?
Yeah.
So it really makes us think about the problem we're trying to solve.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. So next one up.
Okay.
The best process is no process.
Right.
Now we're not saying we should work in chaos here.
Right, of course.
But what's the insight here for learning professionals?
So I think the key is that we need to focus on results and not just follow a process, because that's how it's always been done.
Right.
Sometimes in L&D, we get so caught up in all these approvals and templates
Yeah.
and bureaucratic stuff
Right.
that we forget why we're doing this.
Yeah.
We're here to create learning experiences that work.
Right.
So this is where a user-centered design approach is super important.
Okay.
You adapt your workflow to meet the needs of the learner
Yeah.
and the project,
Right.
rather than just blindly following steps.
Instead of spending weeks and weeks just getting documentation together before you even start prototyping anything.
Exactly.
Yeah, this principle says, get a prototype out there, quickly get feedback, and then adapt from there.
Right.
If it adds no value, it's just excess.
Yeah,
It seems like a much more agile and responsive way to work.
it really is. Yeah.
So this raises an important question, too, about how adaptable are our processes? Are they actually helping us create these timely, relevant learning solutions?
Right.
Or are they accidentally making us less effective?
Good question. Yeah.
Are we so stuck in our ways that we're missing out on being more efficient and having more impact?
Yeah, maybe.
All right, lots to think about there. Let's move on to the next one.
Go ahead.
Question every requirement. You'll be surprised what's irrelevant.
Right.
This emphasizes how important it is to challenge assumptions
It really does.
in our work.
Yeah.
So how does that translate to L&D,
I think it means we have to do a much more thorough needs analysis.
Okay.
So instead of just taking what stakeholders tell us and running with it,
Yeah.
we really need to keep asking why.
Okay, why what?
Exactly. Why is this content important?
Yeah.
Why this format? Why all this detail?
Right.
And when you start challenging the stuff that's been there forever,
Yeah.
and even what the experts think,
Yeah.
you'll be surprised how much of it isn't really needed anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that example of taking those long and boring compliance decks
Ah,
and turning them into engaging scenarios. You're still covering what's important, really in a way that people are more likely to remember and actually use.
Yeah.
Old rules may linger. Don't follow them ignorant.
Love it.
It's about making sure that every single thing in that learning experience is helping people do their jobs better.
Absolutely.
So when we zoom out and look at the bigger picture here,
Yeah.
it's about respecting the learner's time, right?
It really is.
They're busy, they're professionals.
They are.
We need to make sure that every minute they spend learning is valuable and relevant to them and the organization. Okay, cool. So let's keep going here. If something must be done, do it fast or it won't last.
Okay.
This one seems to highlight how critical it is to deliver learning on time.
It does. What's interesting is that we're seeing more and more demand for just-in-time learning.
Yeah.
Learners need information right when they need it,
Yeah.
not in some big training session weeks before.
Right.
And this also ties in with the whole prototype over polish idea.
Okay.
It's often better to get something functional out there quickly,
Yeah.
even if it's not perfect.
Right.
Then you get feedback and make it better.
Yeah.
Because if you wait for everything to be perfect,
Yeah.
it might be too late.
Right. It might not be relevant anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So think about launching a minimum viable product.
Yeah. MVP.
An early version of a course or a resource. Just get it out to people, get their thoughts, and keep improving it.
Yeah. Slow work's a trap. Momentum gets you past.
I love that.
Right? This agile approach lets you keep adapting and delivering value much quicker. But this makes me wonder, how comfortable are we in L&D with things not being perfect right away? Are we so focused on that flawless final product that we miss chances to give people something helpful much sooner?
That's a good question.
Okay, next principle.
All right.
Fail fast, learn faster.
Okay.
This one's all about seeing mistakes as opportunities
Right.
for growth for both the learner and the designer.
Exactly.
So how do we apply that in L&D?
So one way is to create these safe failure environments,
Okay.
like simulations, VR scenarios,
Yeah.
or even branching narratives in e-learning,
Mm.
where learners can mess up without real-world consequences.
Yeah.
And the key is they learn from those mistakes.
Right.
And we as designers need to think the same way.
Yeah.
If we test our stuff early and often,
Yeah.
we can find problems and areas to improve much faster.
Yeah. So like piloting a new simulation with a small group.
Exactly.
We're basically creating a safe space to see how they use it.
Yeah, where they struggle, what parts they like,
Oh.
before you launch it to everyone.
Right. Mistakes are tuition, but progress is the master.
I like that.
And this iterative process ultimately leads to better learning experiences.
I like this.
But taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, it's about creating a culture in L&D where it's okay to experiment and to keep improving.
Right.
We shouldn't be afraid to try new things and learn from what doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's how we get better and create solutions that actually have an impact.
That's how we evolve.
All right, we're almost there. A really important one now.
Okay.
Assume you're wrong, then prove you're right.
Okay.
This one seems to be all about being humble and questioning everything.
Yeah.
And relying on data to make decisions.
It is.
So how does that look in the L&D world?
So we need to use data to see if our learning is actually working.
Okay.
Measure things like engagement knowledge,
Yeah.
retention,
Yeah.
and how it's impacting job performance.
Mhm.
and A/B testing, different formats or delivery methods. That helps us see what really works for learners.